This is how to adjust the rear height of your motorcycle on a sport bike like this. This video focuses on adjusting the preload and the height adjustment for the rear shock on a sport bike like this. The last video showed how to measure different sag parameters, and the next one shows the final sag suspension setup. So both of the links to both of those videos are in the description below, and if you're just starting, it's probably good to watch them all just to have the entire big picture of what's going on here.
I'll be using an Aprilia RSV4 1100 factory for today, and it's equipped with Öhlins suspension front and rear.
For background, when I bought the bike, I had them put the Fat Boy rear spring on the shock, but it still had the factory springs in the front forks, which are a lot harder to change. Because of that and all the adjustments I had to make cranking on the preload and everything up here on the front end, it caused some geometry issues where you're gonna see. Spoiler alert, I ended up having to go back and change out the front fork springs for the Fat Boy springs, which is what I should have done in the first place. And the links to the video on changing out the front fork springs and these other related videos are all in the description below.
Since I want to adjust the preload on the spring, I actually want to back off the preload so I get a little bit more rider sag on the rear. So I have this wrench. See those two rings up at the top of the spring? I loosened the top one first, and then I'm backing off the lower one, and I'll just keep backing off the lower one until I get the rider sag where I want it. I finally have it to a 9/16, which is 14 millimeter static sag, and a 1 1/8 inch or 29 millimeter rider sag. And I've got that top nut tightened down on the bottom one, so everything's tight and good. The sag on the rear is now finished, which means I have the sag on the rear and the front where I want. I'm happy with those numbers. The next step is to get the geometry right. Even before messing with the rear end and just doing the sag on the front, effectively what I did is I raised the front of the bike. And when you raise the front, you kick the forks out more and you increase your rake angle. When you increase the rake angle, it makes the bike harder to lean into a turn and less flickable. I raised the front and then I lowered the rear, which means those forks are really kicked out and it's going to be even worse for handling as far as going into turns. So now that the sag's set, and my damping set, now I have to get the bike back to the geometry I want to make it easier to turn. The front forks are where they were from the factory. In other words, you've got 3 rings up in the gold. So I don't want to mess with those, which means my adjustment has to come from the rear end. That means I have to get into here and adjust the height of the rear end with that link. And what that means is that the rear end has to come up in position, like height. Nothing to do with preload or damping. I'm talking about the actual height of it. And so the rear end needs to come up so that the front gets a little less rake and it becomes easier to steer. You don't want to do too much at once with this. 5 millimeters of change in the length of the shock is considered a pretty big difference that really affects your handling. If you do too much and make it too low of a rake, the bike will get unstable, you'll end up with head shake and you could crash. So you don't want to do too much. I'm only going to do probably around 2.5 millimeters of difference. Try it and then see if that's good or if I want to go any more from there. But you want to do it incremental, even though it's kind of a pain to get in here and do this, just to be safe so you don't wreck your bike. I've got the bike supported with the jack stands and the 1/2 inch drill rod through the frame again so that the wheel is floating. And that's what I want, because when I take this shock loose, you can see that bolt right there is what has to come out to free the bottom of the shock. And then I'm going to back off the jam nut. I'm going to back it out, which will raise the rear end. And the reason the wheel is floating is because when I pull that out, that'll let this go to the ground. I won't be fighting with gravity pushing the link back into the shock, go back here. Used a 13 and a 15 mil wrenches. Got the nut off the end of it. Now I'm going to try to use a screwdriver to push that bolt through the other side. Now remember, the weight of this wheel is what's pulling that link down against the bolt. So by supporting this wheel with one hand, I can push that bolt through with the other hand a lot easier because the weight's not on it. And the bolt just won't quite come out. It's so close, but the exhaust is in the way, so I'm gonna have to take the pipe off. You don't need to completely remove the pipe, but you gotta take the bolt that holds this to the footrest out and then loosen that bolt down there enough that you can twist the pipe out of the way, and now you can get that bolt out. Had to take this bolt out as well. Just having that front one out still doesn't give me clearance, so now hopefully I can rotate these out of the way. I was already this far, so I just took the bolt out of the top of the shock, and that drops my bottom in an area where I can more easily get at it. Used a 15/16 box end wrench and a crescent wrench, and was able to get the jam nut loose. With the jam nut all the way down against this boss, there's a 3mm gap between the two nuts. So all I need to do is turn this piece out till it reads 6mm in the gap, then tighten the jam nut, and I should be good to reinstall everything. I've backed it off to where it's 6mm now instead of 3. So now it's a 6mm gap. Now I'm going to tighten the jam nut. Jam nut's tight at the designated length. The bolt is back in the top of the shock. I'm not going to tighten it until I get all the other bolts in first. The upper bolt on the shock is torqued. All the bolts I took loose on the bottom linkage is torqued. Now I just have to set the slip-on back in place, tighten that bolt, and attach it to the rear foot peg. Exhaust is all solid back in place. Now I just need to pop it down off the stands.
Now after raising the rear of the bike, it did help balance out the preload that I'd applied to the front. So the tip-in was a little bit better because the rake was closer to where it should have been. However, what I noticed as I rode it more, once I'd get in sweepers where I'm doing, say, 110, 20 or more, the rear end got really squirrely on me. So it was obvious that even those 3mm I'd adjusted, the height in the rear had done something to the geometry in the handling, and it just did not feel good at those higher speeds. As I mentioned, I did end up installing the proper Fat Boy springs in the front forks, and that meant that I had to go back and put all the geometry back to where it should be from the factory. In other words, that meant undoing the 3mm height increase I'd done on the rear, put that back, got everything set with the right geometry, then got all my dampening and everything set right, and the bike rides like a dream now. It was a slow, painful reminder that all the dial turning and adjustments cannot overcome a problematic initial component like having the wrong springs. So just do the right thing in the first place and you'll save yourself a lot of headaches. If you haven't done so, please click the link below to subscribe, click the little bell for notifications, and let's live for today.